Order. I have accepted a statement from the Victoria Youth Parliament proposing the following matter of public importance for discussion. That this House notes the presence of monopolies, duopolies and concentrated markets in a range of essential industries in Australia, notes the high cost of living for Australians, which disproportionately impacts young people and young families, and calls for the Commonwealth Government to introduce break-up powers for concentrated markets. I call on the Premier.
Speaker, the Honourable Member Mezzacappa. We live in a time where some Australians are cutting back on eating red meat because it's too much of a cost. We live in a time where the price of bread has risen to 11.2% and the price of milk 15.4%. We live in a time where Australian families can't even afford basic necessities due to the cost of living perpetrated by monopolies in Australia. The motion to break up powers for monopolies and duopolies must be supported for the sake of our families and our youth who cannot afford to feed themselves, for the sake of good quality Australian products and produce, for the sake of our farmers and for the sake of our independent and local businesses. This motion must be moved. The government's intervention will create an enormously good and lasting impact, not only for Australia's economy, but for all our farmers, shoppers, consumers and suppliers. This intervention is needed now. If anybody here cares for the people of this country, they would recognise its youth and its families are suffering.
I would now like to call upon the Honourable Youth Premier Mezzacappa, who will be discussing the underfunding of public schools.
Speaker, the Honourable Member Mezzacappa. I would like to address this to the Honourable Member, the Minister of Education, Ben Carroll. How many times does this topic have to be brought up? Brought up by the ABC, The Conversation, the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, and countless more. How many times do students need to raise their voice before this issue will be taken seriously? I am here as one of those students to warn the Labor Party that the issue of underfunding in public schools is past the point of advocacy and rather at the point of action. The Schooling Resource Standard was put in place by this government to be responsible, and so it is supposed to regulate school funding allocations. However, it was found that just last year, private schools were overfunded by $800 million, while public schools were hit with a shortfall of $4.5 million this year. This is a flat-out insult to all Australian public school students. This is not a fair and equal education. This is not a regulation of schooling resources. This is injustice. Members of Parliament, the Labor Party claims it wants to help public education. Yes, this government's support for public education is so strong that their contributions to private schools are over 30% more than public schools. Recently, this government released, I'm going to call it a voucher, a $400 voucher that will be given to all students and families from disadvantaged areas. $400, what is that? Some textbooks? A school jacket and some uniform? It doesn't get you a laptop, but most importantly, it does not get you a better education. $400 will not change the large achievement gaps between high socioeconomic and low socioeconomic students, because ultimately it does not address the problem of underfunding in Australian public schools. $400 will not change the achievement gaps between high socioeconomic students or Indigenous and remote area students, because ultimately it does not address the problem of underfunding in Australian public schools. The government claims it supports public school education and even recognises the fact that 92% of kids with disadvantaged backgrounds attend state government schools. Further, the government states they are putting the most needy and important members of our community first. While I commend this administration for taking a step in the right direction, I really have to ask, if the Labor Party is aware of the fact that 92% of disadvantaged students go to public schools, why wouldn't they better the schools that these students go to? Why wouldn't they better the public education system? The gigantic gap in resources is detrimental to our society as it creates segregation between our students. Recently, the OECD released the fact that Australia ranked 8th in terms of social segregation out of 71 countries and 4th out of the OECD. This government needs to take action now, and a bill needs to be drafted to properly and carefully regulate school funding so that no student is left behind. It's not fair to some parents and guardians who have to break their backs to afford a better education for their kids by sending them to private schools rather than close and local public schools. It's not fair to students who go to disadvantaged schools who struggle more with education because of their lack of resources. I call on the honourable members of this Parliament to raise their voices and affirm the fact that all Australian students deserve a fair and equal opportunity to fair and equal education. I hope that the government recognises these voices here today, because this youth parliament has spoken. Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for their contribution.
Speaker, the Honourable Member Mezzacappa, I'd like to remind the honourable members of this Parliament of the fact that this Victorian State Parliament is confined to residual and state powers with regards to Victorian legislation. This bill should not be passed under the pretext that in clauses 4.1 FII, 4.2 HII, and 4.3 HII will directly violate Section 109 of the Constitution, the Australian Constitution, if it's passed as a law. In reference to those clauses, this bill cannot magically subsidise HECS or decide entry conditions, as HECS is a Commonwealth-supported loan scheme. It's federal law, it's Commonwealth law. Passing this bill, as it is now, would activate Section 109. For the honourable members who might not know or be familiar, when Victorian legislation is passed in this Parliament and it's inconsistent with Commonwealth law, which this bill clearly is, the Commonwealth law shall prevail and the inconsistencies would be overridden. The inconsistency of this bill is that the VHRMA claims illusory and false power over the federal law. This bill should not be passed, as Victorian legislation cannot override the Commonwealth powers. I remind honourable members that your government is not arguing against the issue of hospital ramping. Rather, we agree it is a serious issue and many of us have been impacted by it. However, this bill does not actively solve the issue. Rather, it goes against our Constitution. Passing these inconsistencies will only create further problems for the future of our society. Honourable members will recognise the inconsistencies of this bill, and honourable members of this Parliament will not pass a law that is false and incorrect. Thank you, Speaker.